conferences. Very important mini conference, half-day conference. This conference comes at a moment when the fascist forces across the globe are taking control of the order of the day. And this conference also comes as a reminder that the world's oppressed communities are in contact with each other, they are talking to each other, they are communicating, and not only doing that, but they are marching ahead. And this very moment emphasizes that we are committed to the human dignity of the people across the world. And this conference is also important because it brings the most marginalized groups into conversation than the elites of the marginalized. And usually it gets merged. People falling into the various affiliations of ideologies represent themselves as oppressed, and in fact they represent the constituency of the oppressor. So the question becomes, where do we draw the line? And that's why today we will meditate on this important panel that we have today. As it is very, how do I say, very eloquently put, it's entitled as Ambedkar's Unfinished Agenda in the United Nations, and we are working towards a UN Convention on elimination of discrimination based on work and descent, including caste. So caste has never been a matter of concern as much as it should have been compared to other issues to the United Nations body and thus to the world. The political organizations and the political elites have often ignored caste because caste does not feature as a recognized and accepted humanity. It also de-recognizes the struggles of the people that have been fighting against this very malice for more than 3,000 years. We have excellent panelists today. It's going to be moderated by Raj. We are in Raj's home. Thank you so much. Raj teaches a wide variety of courses. I would like to start by introducing him. And I was looking at his, and some of his, he's a philosopher who has a PhD from UC Irvine. He has BA from UC Berkeley. He's also a student of Jacques Derrida. And one of the important aspects I found about Raj's work is Raj actually engages philosophy as a public practice. He brings ethics into the domain of how we interrogate the power structures, the inequality, and also he is engaged into critical race as well as caste theories. So this is something that is involved, that we are thinking collectively, that we want to bring the aspects of race and caste, the aspect of black and Dalit into conversation, and to launch what we would call 21st century's new model. Du Bois called it the 20th century's problem as being color, maybe 21st would be color and caste. And on that front we are working. So Raj will be moderating the panel. We have Paul Divakar. I have Paul's introduction. I will read it out. So Paul, of course, most of us know, and personally, as I know, as I read through literatures of anti-caste activism, Paul's name often features. And it doesn't only feature, but it comes with outer responsibilities, because Paul has been leading the struggle for more than 3 decades now. And Paul is a recognized figure in the international United Nations and civil society bodies movement. He's an advocate for Dalit rights, economic rights expert, and a human rights defender. He is one of the founding members of National Campaign on Dalit Rights and is currently the General Secretary of Dalit Adhikar Andolan, Ardhik Adhikar Andolan of the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights. He also serves as the chairperson of Asia Dalit Rights Forum, which works in the South Asia region to ensure inclusion and to address the issues of untouchability and caste-based discrimination. He has been one of the key actors in popularizing the Sustainable Development Goals and to bring in the aspect of inclusion in the discourse in the development paradigm. From 2013 to 17, for the 4 years, he served as a member of Executive Board of Amnesty International. He has been recently voted by Outlook magazine as one of the 50 most influential Dalit leaders in the country. Shout out to Paul. He has also had a team of 150 academics, Dalit leaders, people's representatives, and professionals, and those in solidarity at the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. Very important. And was one of the 3 people who addressed the heads of the nations. He engaged with several UN agencies and supported the Office of the High Commissioner in development of a guidance tool to address caste discrimination. This is a brief profile of Paul. If I end up reading the whole, it would be about sparing Paul's work. We also have our own Magda Matache. She comes from a place that has often been ignored within the human rights discourses of the larger social justice movements. She comes from a constituency that has often been relegated to a very modest form of discrimination and has been very much caricatured under the European dominance of white people's gaze. She comes as a Roma activist who is currently directing a Roma studies program at Harvard and is also a Mason mid-career fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. In addition to that, I was reading Magda's scholarly and as well activist writing, and I was impressed the way she is single-handedly leading, and predominantly for the Anglo audience, the Anglophone audience, the work that has to be done. And she's immensely engaged in public policy documents, and her writings have appeared in reputed journals, European Review. She and me wrote one, co-authored a piece together, which I'm very proud, where we compared Roma and Dalit. So thank you, Magda, for cherishing your presence. And now finally we have Abdarahman Wone. Brother Abda is known for his activism to end racism and slavery in the country of his birth, Mauritania. He is born in Kaidi on June 16, 1973. Abda and his family were forced to move to Senegal in 1989. At the origin of the class lawsuit against Mauritanian dictator Ould Taya in New York, Abda Wone is a trained journalist. He has a postgraduate degree from Columbia and is currently managing the communications for Codesria, the very reputed institution of Africa, which is also entitled as Council for the Development of Social Sciences Research in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome moderator and panelist on the floor, and let's engage with them. Thank you.
Actually, what we want to do is, instead of, since you'll be speaking individually, why don't you just stay? It will be kind of awkward to sit while each one is going to come individually. I'll introduce the agenda and the format in a second. And then at the end, we'll invite all three for a plenary group discussion. So first of all, I want to welcome you all to the Brandeis house, the family. I want to thank Suraj Yende, Sanjay Bhagat from Boston Study Group, and our own Jaspreet Mahal, who's also part of the Brandeis. She's a graduate of the Heller School of Social Policy and Women and Gender Studies, and has recently taken a job at the university on disability inclusion and rights in the classroom. Brilliant work that she's doing there. So I want to thank the sponsors for this wonderful event. What I'd like to do is introduce each individual speaker to come for about roughly 30 minutes plus. We'll see how the conversation goes. We'll have a Q&A discussion, interaction discussion with the audience for each individual speaker. So first we'll start with Paul Divakar, we'll get to Magda Matache, and then Abdarahman Wone. So the idea is that we'll go, it's already roughly speaking 11 o'clock. We want to go as far as we possibly can. I'll see where the breaking point is. We'll have a lunch, and then we can get the food, come back, and then have a group discussion with all three present in the front. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul Divakar to come up to the stage, and then I will bring up his PowerPoint, and then we can commence. And please tell me, this unfortunately is not working today, so if you can't hear in the back, we can speak up further, or you let us know what you can hear.
Yeah, we can also move and close.
Yeah, it's up to you.
That's easier.
Please, Paul. So, I think the best thing to do is, if you want to, is the screen doesn't. All you have to do is hit this down after you start. Okay. So you just then you have to. All you have to do is everything.
It gives me a great honor to be with you today. Of course, it's been, I think about 3 years since I've been so fascinated by the series. I think it is Ambedkar's Unfinished Agenda. And you have rocked the country here in the US, but also globally because wherever I go, people tell me, yeah, have you heard about these cities? And not just here, I think back home in India, we hear so much about these conferences. And we hear your name, we hear Larry's name, of course, Boston Study Group with Sanjay, Suraj, Jaspreet, Pradeep, so many, I think many of you, many of them, Sanjay says, are unable because they're out of the country. So, before I start, I'd really like to acknowledge the Boston Study Group, the tremendous work that you're doing in educating several of us and across the world. Because whatever happens in Harvard or Boston is actually happening in the world. And of course, there's a good thing to it. There's also, so much of hype. But the good thing is that this issue, which is continuously being relegated, and I think this is the one of the crimes that people don't officially talk about it. One of the violations of human rights, and this is not probably sufficiently been studied, is how you invisibilize an issue. And you invisibilize this because for decades, India had one of the very powerful civil rights movement, and Dalit rights don't matter to the civil rights movement. The UN has been the champion of human rights, and despite several efforts, Dalit rights affecting 260 million people, and if all these 260 million people were to be in one place, we would be the 6th largest nation in the world, and they're not even raise a flutter in the UN. Nobody hears. The Sustainable Development Goals says that leave no one behind and put the last one front, and today does not even mention about Dalit rights. And what about Dalit rights? It doesn't recognize the Roma rights, doesn't recognize the Haratim rights, doesn't even recognize the Kilambo rights, doesn't even, such a huge, it's like a volcano. And if you don't address it, it's not just affecting Dalits or Haratim or Roma or Kilambu or many other such communities across the world, but it affects the body politic of the world. Because we, Haratim, we Roma, we Dalits, we can survive. We are like the good-natured of any of these people who have outpassed all disasters. We have outpassed all mass murders. But it is the wider society, the body politic, the democratic threads of this will not be able to sustain if you don't really listen to the 260 million people. Maybe more, because you have not studied sufficiently looked at the Chinese exclusion. And studies are coming out. Japan still exists, the Korean, the Filipino. Several of these systems. So really thank you for making this. And what I hear from Sanjay and Larry last time, they were sharing that they would have such a conference again. May not be in 2018, but 2019. But I think keep doing this, because this is the only way to support the activism on the ground. Of course, there has to be a very mutual strengthening of each other. And this is the other thing. There is such a divide between the activists and academics. I think people like us will really need to bring this together. And I feel very, very sad when I see activists going against the academics and academics totally ignoring the work of the activists. And I think somewhere I feel very, very sad, which has somehow managed to bring these things together. But today, I would like to talk about these two people and once again recall to our memory the powerful men who shaped the agenda of the world. And we all know when you say non-violence and peace, we recall one other face of Mr. Mohandas, but not remember Ambedkar, and so on. The remembrance of the December 6th importance of Baba Saheb
Nirvana.
Parinirvan and the tomorrow's World Human Rights Day, I think it's only right that we will call to the memory the powerful wave of these two, and these two have really set a very global agenda that I would like to recall. So I don't want to get into what it means to be a Dalit and the kind of violations. I mean, even now, Somnath, yesterday, 3 days ago, many of you would have seen viral the kind of images that have gone across of some literally butchering and setting on fire some of these things. Of course, we do not know why these things are going on well, but there are pros and cons of the kind of violations that are going on, which are unspeakable, which you cannot think that they are still happening in current world. So I'm not going into it, and I don't think an august body like this, who has basic interest in the Dalit rights violations, need to know. So I'm only going to look at what has been the human rights agenda in the UN and the prevalence of this across the world. What does it mean? A new term which has come in, which I don't like it, though I was one of the persons who's forced to accept this at the UN, which is called discrimination based on work and descent. Many of us don't agree with this term, but however, this is the term that is giving representation to the issue, and for want of a better term, we still have to keep up with this. Let me just set my clock. It is 11, I started 5 minutes ago. So we are looking at this word, which is, in India we have a department of PWD, and somewhere, whenever I think of DWD, it's something like, public works or something like that. But this is discrimination based on work and descent. It's a compromise term that has been evolved when in the prelude to the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, which has taken place, and unfortunately, the 9/11 disaster that has rocked the world happened, I think, Joel, just 3-4 days after the World Conference. And that has offset the gains that were made by the World Conference Against Racism. World Conference Against Racism finished on the 4th of September 2001, and I think 5 days later, the world traversed, and that has changed, because otherwise, one of the major gains which has brought in African descent community, the blacks, the Palestinian, and the Dalits together in a very unprecedented manner in Durban, South Africa, would have really brought us to a different level now. I don't think today it would have been a different nature, but I think because of that, it has totally been obliterated. Now, in the run-up to the World Conference Against Racism, when we had intervened it was just before the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Body has been restructured. The body at that time was under the under the Committee for Human Rights. It was Subcommission for Protection and Promotion of Human Rights. That was the body which has set the agenda for the World Conference. And all the country representatives were discussing, and suddenly we had a delegation. We had a delegation in trying to look at whether this is a body which can take in and discuss the agenda of the Dalit rights as part of the racism of other forms, because we know that casteism is not racism, but it's akin to racism in the sense that the impact of the structure of casteism has similar effects on the way of enjoyment of human rights. So therefore, the barriers of racism and casteism are the same. So therefore, you need to address this as part of World Conference Against Human Rights, xenophobia, and other forms. It's not just about racism. But you know, my country has come in a massive way against us and started objecting. And it is very funny to see that those who are representing India, and you may have heard of a person by name Soli Sorabji. Soli Sorabji was at that time the Attorney General of the country, and he's also regarded very high on the human rights agenda. And Justice Bhagwati. You can see, and Justice Bhagwati also is a very big name in the human rights. He was the Supreme Court Justice, and I think he was also the Chief Justice at one point. And he and Soli Sorabji opposed this at the behest of the representatives of the Indian bureaucrats who were manning or who were resourcing the India mission at the UN. They said, don't believe these guys. They are just here to upset the India. They are being supported by Pakistan and others. And, this has nothing to do. Racism is different. And there's a whole lot of lies and manipulations. Soli Sorabji knew. Bhagwati, he knew, and they don't think he could stand up. So Soli Sorabji started engaging with the missions. Then he called for a discussion, and we said, see, this is not about casteism. This is not about India, please. This is about the systems of hierarchy and the systems which have ingrained into the culture, which you are not responsible. Indian democratic government is really not responsible for bringing this system. So America had a system. The transatlantic slavery had brought in different systems. Patriarchy is another form of discrimination. Then they have a huge, in 1995, there was a World Conference on Women. And this is something like that. It's not that any one particular country has brought it. So you don't have to defend or search your shoulders, so to say, that this is an issue which you will have to defend, and that your government has to defend. This is something which is affecting across. Nepal has the system. And at that time, it was only a few countries we could gather the support. So finally, instead of caste, using the word caste, he said, okay, look here. This caste, and you say it has happens in different other forms, other countries. So why don't we, that time we had also had people from Buraku community, leaders from Buraku community, from Japan, who have exactly the similar forms of discrimination. Any leather work, any sanitation work, any forms of butchery, and forced occupations had been imposed on this community called Buraku. So because Buraku don't have in that sense caste, so why don't we use the word discrimination intergenerationally coming, which is descent, and forced occupation. So intersectionality of descent and work is the thing. So why don't you agree for it? Otherwise, we will not. And you needed somebody to move this motion. So finally, you need to have 7 people for moving this motion. So finally, UN representative, UK representative broke the deal with Soli Sorabji and said that let's have discrimination based on work and descent. And some of us have said no, but then was the only way to include also the other communities like Roma and in other countries and at Buraku. So we said, okay, let's have it discrimination based on work and descent. So they said they cannot accept it because UN itself has not studied the nature, the forms, and mechanisms that are there available in different countries. So UN subcommission, I'll share with it a little later, was one of the first times where they had started a study. They appointed one Gunasekara, R.W. Gunasekara, the member from Sri Lanka, who was taken the responsibility to study. So what is this discrimination? What is the way that they have defined discrimination? Any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference inherited such as caste, including the present or ancestral occupation, family, community, or social origin, name, birthplace. You have, the way we say there are about 21 to 22 forms, or maybe much more, of how one can identify who person from a caste is. I think all of us here don't need that, but many still ask me, even now, when I tell them this, how do you find out that one can find out a person is a Dalit or not? You don't need it. But there are really, I think we need to document it in some way. What are the forms today you can identify? What are the markers for caste? So birthplace, place of residence, dialect, marriage, I think they have not put in, which has a purpose of effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, exercise, or an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other forms of life. So it has very rigid occupational hierarchy, imposing several prohibitions, and if you cross the line of these prohibitions, the backlash violence that is meted out is there. Okay, I think this has chewed up the other part. So the nature and forms of discrimination, again, I will not go in, but just to bring to a memory, it has prohibitions. I think Joel and we, way back in 1996 or 98, maybe 98, we did the study and came up with around 160 forms of exclusions of untouchability. And I think it was nationwide, it was coordinated by Professor Thorat and sponsored by Acme. For the first time, we had formed these forms of prohibitions, right from, in some places you are prohibited from wearing cooling glasses, I don't know what you call it. You can't wear your saris full, and several distinctions, restrictions, forced menial labor, which I think my friend Abda will share more how it is happening in Africa. Discriminations and exclusion on civic amenities. Even though it is not their father's property, it's the public property, and you can't draw or have an equal access to water or even any public offices. We did one study on infrastructure and exclusion and how the location and even access is restricted. And discrimination from civic amenities, violence, and the modern forms of slavery. Well, it is a misnomer that it exists only in Asia or India. Or let me say, when I started this work, way back, I don't know, maybe in 83, I was part of a agricultural workers trade union in Telangana state, what was then Andhra Pradesh. And we never thought that among the agricultural workers, there is this discrimination. And then among the trade union itself, it split into two because it would not address a Dalit atrocity, a murder of one of our members in the agricultural workers union. And people forbid me from taking action And then when we challenged it, the whole a community called Reddy in Telangana, I think many of you would know, they have said that this is actually divisive, and so we will split, and then we continue. That's when I really realized. So then when some of us started working on the Dalits, we never knew that this thing was in other parts. Then much later we realized the similar are existing, of course, in Tamil Nadu. It was only in 1998, for the first time, when we had come together as a platform of National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, did we realize it's a pan-Indian in Jammu and Kashmir, in Assam, in Manipur, Northeast. Of course, God's own country in Kerala, rampant form of discrimination. West Bengal. I mean, wherever you go, this things. And then later we realize, Brother Purna is here, how with the Dalit community leaders in Nepal, we had come to realize that this is a similar thing in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka. But then that was our worldview. Not unless we came with, there's a representative of the Oru community from Nigeria, and we managed to link together. And in the run-up to the World Conference, we started slowly linking with leaders of the Roma community, of the Nigerian community, Burakumin. And then, now you see, I mean, this itself is an emerging map with Japan and Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, Niger, I mean, all those, let me not get into that, where Abda will be sharing. And the entire Europe, I think this map still has not put, sorry, the Europe part of it. The discrimination based on work and descent, just as my own experience thought that, it exists only in my village in Telangana, it's a, forms may differ, names may differ, but it exists globally. And two people we should really look at who have introduced. Maybe Suraj would have already shared the letters that Du Bois has written in the exchange between Ambedkar and Du Bois, where Ambedkar felt, Baba Saheb had felt, that you need to put this, it was an invitation, he was responding to an invitation from Du Bois, that at the formation of the evolution of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that we need to include. And we really do not know what happened. I do not know whether there is a further study, Suraj, on this. What has forbidden? I'm sure the fight between the kind of independence that Baba Saheb was so deeply concerned must have prevented sending anybody or going himself, because it happened, that was around 1942 or 43, when the whole UDHR was being evolved. That's also the time post-Pune Pact and all that also was taking place. We really don't know. But suddenly, there is a blank. And Du Bois, really, his efforts to bring in the Dalit issue. But then there have been another wave, and this has not sufficiently been recognized. My time is running out, so let me just go. There's a lot of exchange, the Buddhist exchange because at that time it was the beginning of the 19th century between South Africa and India. Through the Buddhists, it was known. I mean, I have not sufficiently studied, but I've heard of traces where this attempt between the Dalits who had been migrated, and many, including, I think you may have heard of Miss Navi Pillai, who was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and was one of the first, most vocal of the High Commissioners, and she herself, though the name Pillai is not Dalit, but we feel that they have used the name only as a flight to take away from their identity back in South Africa. But she mentioned that her father was an Indian church, or her grandfather was an Indian church who were brought. And therefore, there have been. Many of you would have heard of Ambedkar Center for Justice and Peace. They have been making right from early 90s. There have been interventions at the UN. Ambedkar International Mission, Raju Kamble and others have been trying to bring, and of course now there is much larger. There is one by name Bishop Azraya of the Church of South India, much to the dismay of the church leaders. He had started this in the World Council of Churches, of talking about the Dalits, of course Dalit Christians, but more so on the necessity of being solidarity with the Dalits. Minority Rights Group International, you may have heard of them. They have made several, but in the hierarchy of the UN, at that time, under the Subcommission for Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, there was a minority forum. So they had, I was one of the fellows who was sponsored by a minority rights group, much before the World Conference Against Racism, to bring this issue. And they had, I think very consciously they had chosen this issue, but somehow they have not sufficiently linked Dalit with the other forms, other typical issues. Then World Conference on Human Rights, there was an attempt, but it was very effectively scuttled. Then this whole thing, which I had already shared with you, World Conference was one of the watersheds, the final or maybe the third wave of watersheds that has come in. As I said, the 2000 resolution passed declaring discrimination based on work and dissent prohibited under international human rights law. They have also termed the work and dissent part of it. And I was telling you, UN expert R.W. Gunasekere and his working paper, if you can just Google R.W. Gunasekere, excellent, the way that he had captured. We worked together with him and managed to have an exposure. And the Indian government termed it a conspiracy. And they denied his report. We had very strongly lobbied. And then Espion ID, as the second UN rapporteur, was appointed and said that because Indian government then said, no, you're only targeting India, which is not true. So Espion ID was another UN expert. He came to look at discrimination in a very wide way. And that was the time we worked with the Human Rights Watch. I do not know, many of you, have you seen this book, Broken People? Broken People was one of the first books by a human rights organization to have brought this out. But Human Rights Watch, with Smita Narula, also authored Caste as a Global Phenomenon. And maybe that was one of the first studies which has brought in the several communities and then created this link. And finally, post World Conference, we must also recall Patrick Thornberry, who was a member of the Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. He was so annoyed, and the entire CERD committee members, except two from, I think it was, sorry, it's I think not Chile, one of the, what is this? Fidel Castro's, which country? Cuba. The member from Cuba was the only one who resisted because of his allegiance to India ideologically, but not, so he supported. But otherwise, entire CERD committee members at that time. And they had, and committee would not allow, or the Indian government would not allow visa to Patrick. So we got him as a trainer and into India, and then he studied the way it is currently is, because all of them know on the academics, how it looks, but it doesn't. They don't think that it is a very virulent form that is existing today. And then he convinced the other committee members, and it's not normally done, that they have, in 2002, they have called for what is called a thematic debate. And after the thematic debate, they came out with what is called General Recommendation 29. General Recommendation, as many of you would know, that for any convention, apart from the observations of country, which is focused on each country's, General Recommendation is like what the Supreme Court has a judgment. Then this is kind of, periodically they issue certain thematic pronouncements of a certain issue or a process, and it's called General Recommendation. And General Recommendation 29 that came in 2002 was declaring this whole myth that race and racism and casteism impact on human rights. They're different, but they said they're different, but the impact on the community's rights to enjoy privileges in a similar way. So therefore, it falls under CERD. So that, I think, is the first such milestone which came in, and then afterwards the Osborne ID and Yokota, the final, they had met the second group of saboteurs, special rapporteurs who brought in. And finally, sorry I didn't mention it here, in 2006, Chin Sung Chung, along with Yokota, had brought out what is called Principles and Guidelines for Elimination of Discrimination Based on Work and Descent. And please, Sampath was trying to actually put it on the screen. I wish we could, maybe at some point you could, when you're closing up, you could try and do, systematically addresses. The Indian government has addressed it, but Indian government has addressed it only and provided remedies only in public education, people's representation, and public employment. And public education and public employment is less than 10% in the entire country. So the 90% of private education and private employment is untouched. You don't have in India a mechanism to address discrimination in the private education or public employment, private employment, corporate employment. And I think Professor Thorat has done a tremendous study looking at the rural markets, the capital markets, the corporate and others, and how employment really affects all these, discrimination affects all these markets. So I'm sure you had it as part of the series, and I think you would have shared. So that whole area is untouched. And Principles and Guidelines for Elimination of Discrimination Based on Work and Descent give a fantastic framework. But alas, as people of Roma, Dalit and Haratim and others would have it, that was also the time when UN was moving from Human Rights Council and from the previous structure of Subcommission and Human Rights Committee on to Human Rights Council. That whole shift has taken place. So even though this document, which was given by the special rapporteurs, was passed, but they have done a very manipulative thing of leaving it in a limbo, neither accepting it nor rejecting it. So 2008, this is 2006, I think it has come in. Until now, every time we ask, and then they say, no, we are unable, because in the Human Rights Council, they didn't have the guts to reject it, but don't have the political will to accept it as an official thing. So, what are the challenges? I think I have 25 minutes over, or 30 minutes over.
You went 40, but it's up to you.
40? Oh, okay.
Oh, we started. It's okay. Because the whole idea is to.
Sorry, yeah. Then let me.
But what we'll do is we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A in response to his speech, and then we'll move to Magda's talk. So it's up to you, Dr. Paul. You can...
So okay, then just let me go through. The challenges is, we all know that it's entrenched in tradition and culture, and the same problem is existing in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Everybody wants to talk about inequality, but they talk of inequality between the countries, between North and South. But nobody wants to touch inequality within the countries. And within the country is what we are wanting. And there is no infrastructure to build a norm which addresses and links these inequalities within the countries globally. And this is something I think we'll have to really push for this. What are the mechanisms? Because between the countries, they have now so many lobbies outside of UN. And they are actually reckoning UN, or wrecking the UN system by having BRICS, by having G20, by having so many others. They are actually, but there is no architecture which is bringing this entrenched form of culture and tradition and saying that, Romas and Dalits, Haratim and Dalits, Kilambo and Dalits, and Buraku and Dalits, because we are so ruled by the nation states. So denial and recognition, always they will deny the whole inadequate of ineffective policies. People tell me, you're wasting your time, don't work at all this, you work on the grassroots, you work. Of course, for 25 years I've only worked at the grassroots. But one of the times it has most articulate, in a way it has come out, is post Ambedkar, is post World Conference Against Racism. During and post World Conference Against Racism, it has been globalized. So don't tell me you all work globally and Dalits can work at the grassroots. Please. Yes, of course. We look elite. We must have passports and visas. We must have English, whatever it is. I mean, sometimes we are forced to follow these elite forms, but then we need a way in which we need to address it. So therefore, whatever is the thing, effective getting policy architecture or norm architecture is very, very important. Building norms is important, but effective is also important. It's not that we are just only talking about here. We are also working. I don't have sufficient time, but then 80% of my work is primarily with the communities and community. So denial of access to justice, vulnerability, uprooted geographically, we are scattered communities, we are unrecognized, lack of things. So these are the two current standards. Principles and guidelines for elimination of discrimination based on work and descent. And we felt that UN itself is not sufficiently poised as an institution and has the capability to address this form. Because you look at it in UNDP and of UNICEF and all these countries, they don't have a clue. So finally, under the present High Commissioner, Hussein, and we thought, okay, a new one from Prince and all that has come, he may not. But then he was one of the first ones in his opening speech, he has addressed issues of caste. And he was convinced, and together with him, we have, or rather, Office of the High Commission has produced this UN guidance tool for all their country teams across the world, UN guidance tool on descent-based discrimination. You will notice very clearly here, work has gone out of the window, and that is the work of India. They had refused to put work because that is the distinct mark between race only and then thing, because it's not just descent, it's a generation, but it's also post-occupations. But it also talks about, it mentions caste, it mentions other forms, so that is something that we have. So friends, I think this is the framework which we are trying to build. We need recognition as a community. You call it whatever it is. It's an affirmative action, it's a reservation, it's some way of identification. People are negatively talking about it in the universe of universal systems, universal schemes. So that unless you have a universal scheme or a scheme which has universal access, this kind of focused approach is a failure. No, we are not convinced. So we need first recognition. We need to bring this issue within the human rights framework and strategies. We need to give recognition of the growing population to children and youth, because that is very, very critical. We need statutory, either affirmative action or employment, both in the public and private, procurement, services in private and public sectors, because this is very critical. It's not just employment, but it's also in the whole supply chain. It's very, very critical. We need legal establishment to look at gender aspect in all this, so there is a gender focus. We need a common legal policy framework for strategies for for women, especially on the education, economic empowerment, including land. We cannot have only patriarchy to dominate in the name of all these, Dalits coming up. We need to give special recognition to the entitlements of women. Of course, political participation, inclusive monitoring mechanisms, mainly in the form during the humanitarian crisis, and these forms. These are the about 8-9 policy frameworks that we need to build nationally as well as globally. And we are not, and many of, when I say we, sorry, it's not the royal we, many of us feel that, of course, there are some who are saying that, first let's ask for domestic and then let us build global. But in the case of vulnerable communities, it is necessary that you come from both the sides, because only within the country we will be overwhelmed and overshadowed, and unless you have a global focus. So therefore you need to work together, and one way of bringing this up is actually working globally and both nationally. So friends, the last slide doesn't show up, I don't know why. I have put a framework, a journey towards UN Convention for Elimination of Discrimination based on work and descent, including caste. Now, there's a long way, but I feel time is right. And for that, one of the things that will really strengthen this is the agency of the communities, the leaders from these communities coming together and convincing and working in solidarity with other human rights forces within the country and internationally to bring this UN Convention for elimination of discrimination based on work and descent. And this, I think, will strengthen the legacy of Baba Saheb Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois. Thank you very much.
So now we'd like to open up the floor for maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll continue to Magda's talk directly after that. And then we'll take a break for lunch, come back, and we'll conclude with Abda's talk, and then do a plenary discussion with all three speakers in the front. So